Phoenix Suns fans are very, very tired of hearing nothing. That's mostly what we've heard since Kevin Durant asked for a trade and all throughout the offseason with all of the Suns' dealings. Today on Locked On Suns, I will go through whether it has hurt or helped the Suns to lay low so much. Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a writer at Suns.com and Dime Magazine, and a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 5 seasons. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen today and every day. You can follow us on Twitter at Locked On PHX Suns. If you're finding us on your favorite podcast platform, hit follow or subscribe. Make sure we are in your feed Monday, Wednesday, and Friday all month long. And if you are finding us on YouTube, a big shout out to you. That's the best way to support the show. Go ahead and hit subscribe down below and drop me a comment telling me whether you think it helps or hurts the Suns to be as quiet as they are in the media and with other teams and just in the general gossip of the league. Because there were a couple of stories this week, I think, that put this into perspective as the Kevin Durant saga lingers on and on and on. And I'm not sure, if it's good or bad. We're going to go through that today. Is it good or is it bad that the Suns don't leak as much as other teams, that they are a little bit closer to the vest with their decisions, right? They have had basically developed this reputation under James Jones as a team that you just don't hear from. And they might be more locked and sealed than any team in the entire NBA at this point. When you think about it, the Spurs used to have that reputation. The Thunder used to have that reputation. But in recent years, I would say the Suns have been even quieter, even harder to parse than these other teams. Like you think back to the draft, people knew that Chet Holmgren was going to be a Thunder, right? They knew that the Spurs had a potential trade on the table with DeJounte Murray for, at least a week before it happened, right? So this is something that the Suns are even tighter with than most teams. So here are the 2 news stories that I think illustrate where we are now with the Suns and the way that their business is handled, basically. So Monday morning this week, and talked about this on Tuesday's show, Shams Charania reports about this ultimatum, a meeting that Kevin Durant has with Joe Tsai in London, England, where he offers him an ultimatum, right? Boston, Miami, and Toronto are reported in Shams' story as the strongest contenders for Durant. And that's a smaller piece of the article. Obviously, what gets the headlines is Durant telling the owner to either fire Sean Marks and Steve Nash or trade him. But this other piece is more related to the Suns, right? Boston, Miami, and Toronto being the strongest contenders. Now, in the days after, we repeatedly heard again that the Raptors are unlikely to include Scotty Barnes, that we can still assume the Miami Heat are unlikely to include Bam Adebayo and currently cannot include Bam Adebayo unless Ben Simmons was sent packing as well, and then that Bam could join the Nets roster. We had people reporting that the Pelicans were possible contenders for Durant even still. So 2 of the teams that Shams reports seem to be less likely than he made it seem. And then one is more likely who wasn't on the list. And then obviously nowhere in there are the Phoenix Suns. Meanwhile, John Gambadoro locally, and I would say Brian Windhorst and Zach Lowe nationally, have all been consistent that the Suns are interested and that the Suns are a team that he would like to go to, as has Chris Haynes, right? But the Suns aren't just missing because they don't leak their own interest here, right? you could make the case, well, Boston, Miami, and Toronto, they got to be reported there because people from those organizations told Shams directly, we are interested. But that's not always how it works, right? There are plenty of times where, and I would say the majority of NBA reporting happens indirectly, meaning Shams reports that the Celtics, Heat, and Raptors are strong contenders for Durant at this point because he heard it from other teams, right? Maybe somebody in New Orleans, or I don't know, list off another team who, the Knicks, whatever it might be, or an agent of a player on one of those other teams, or an agent of a player on the Celtics, Heat, or Raptors, right? They tell him, yeah, it sounds like these three squads are pursuing KD. So again, it's not just that the Suns don't have some designated person to call Shams Charania directly and say, yep, we're interested, put our name in there. That's not always what happens. I would say that's rarely what happens. Instead, the Suns are also missing here because they don't gossip the way that other front offices do, right? They're not making the rounds, calling their assistant general manager buddies or pro personnel scout buddies or whatever it might be and saying, yeah, we're interested in Durant, or, oh, Rich Kleiman's being such a pain in the what. Like those conversations, those gossipy conversations, the Suns keep those to a minimum if they happen at all. And so when Phoenix is able to deal transparently with Brooklyn directly, which we can assume has been the majority of what they've done here, just talking to the Nets, then nothing really gets out. On the other hand, you have another even more peculiar story where Adrian Wojnarowski that same day ignores the KD report altogether. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is just because, Shams is his rival, basically, right? And it's this thing that ESPN has always done where until somebody else is able to verify the reporting from their network, they act like it didn't happen. Now, they've gotten a little better with this, but it's still something that they do. But no, Woj did not ever go on the record confirming this. He did not show up on SportsCenter to say, sources confirmed to ESPN, blah, blah, blah. ESPN waited 6 hours until Joe Tsai tweeted a response to Kevin Durant's reported ultimatum to finally cover this story on their network. So what does that all mean? Sean Marks and Steve Nash getting protected by the biggest sports network that there is, ignoring the news that their star player wants them fired, right? And at the same time, as a result of what we can assume is Woj orchestrating that, because there's plenty of rumors and back channel stuff, if you read around, that indicates he does this kind of thing. At the same time, Woj then gets to keep that connection, right? He has had Sean Marks on his podcast 3 times, I believe, and he had Steve Nash, I believe, on the show when he got hired. It's no secret that those two have a relationship, Marks and Woj. And all throughout this summer, it's not been hard to find that most of the reporting that Woj has done is coming from Marks and tends to benefit Marks. So he gets to keep that relationship and maybe the best chance at breaking this story if and when Kevin Durant eventually gets traded, which is important to him, important to his employer, and everything else. This is a pattern from all throughout this saga, and part of why I've been optimistic all along a little bit about the Suns, right? Woj hasn't mentioned the Suns much at all. I mentioned that Wendy and Zach Lowe have, but you have not heard Adrian Wojnarowski reporting the Suns' interest very much when he talks about this situation. And it's likely, in my opinion, it's likely because Brooklyn doesn't think it needs leverage over the Suns. That can come for a variety of reasons. Maybe the pessimistic take is they don't feel like they need leverage over the Suns because they don't anticipate trading Kevin Durant to the Suns at all, and they don't take it seriously. But I think there's also a chance, and again, that part of my slight optimism on this is that they see Phoenix as a likely potential finalist anyway. They kind of know, because Durant asked to be traded to the Suns in the first place, that there's this assumption, yeah, we're going to have to deal with Phoenix, and it doesn't make any sense for us to be out there waving around the fact that we are giving into his request, that we are actually talking to the Suns. Like, you have not really heard much concrete reporting about the Suns and Nets talks at all. And that's part of why it can feel like we're all going crazy just assuming that it's still happening. But if you look at the reporting part of this and the Suns making noise or not making noise part of this, in both of these stories, the Suns are hurt in the public eye to a degree, right? They're not getting mentioned as suitors. They're not getting talked about as, substantial parts of all of this. Or in some cases, the whole story is being ignored, even if the Suns are still there because of political stuff. But it remains to be seen whether it helped or hurt them behind the scenes, right? We don't know. We won't know until they get him or they don't, and we hear some reporting after the fact about exactly what went down. But in both news cycles, you see the pros and cons of the Suns operating in the shadows. And next up, I'll tell you why overall the Suns are winners when they keep quiet, even if they don't get Kevin Durant. First, today's show, guys, brought to you, as we always are, by BetOnline. BetOnline is your number one source for all sports betting. They have bets, they have news, they have analysis, they have articles, podcasts, all of it, you name it, live betting, esports, and more. They have NBA team wins up already for most teams, although I don't believe they do have the Phoenix Suns. Over under is 52.5, which I appreciate because I believe it was even lower than that last year, and there was much less uncertainty around this team. 52.5 feels low. I would probably still say the over there, but we have a lot to figure out as we're going to continue talking about today. Head to BetOnline or their mobile app and check out all of the latest action. BetOnline, where the game starts. So we're going to go how the Suns win by keeping quiet, how they don't. I want to give you some examples of what I mean as we continue to talk about this strategy by James Jones to not be as public-facing as a lot of the NBA is. The NBA loves to gossip. The NBA loves to whisper and leak and all of it, and James Jones just has bucked that trend completely. So how do the Suns benefit when they lay low? In the Kevin Durant situation specifically, we will talk later about some past examples, and it's not always the same. But in this case, how do they benefit? Well, they don't give up any leverage to Brooklyn, right? As long as the Nets kind of keep the social pact together of being relatively quiet about all of this, they don't give up any leverage to the Nets, right? By talking about what's going on, by admitting that they're interested. It's always a sign of desperation to be the one leaking substantial information, right? As we saw, for example, with the Nets leaking, we don't know this, but my assumption is the Nets were the ones who leaked the Jaylen Brown stuff, right? It was them publicizing the going rate, right? And that was a signal of desperation because within that report, it was like, we don't want Derek White. We want Marcus Smart. We don't want one first-round pick. We want 2 or 3 or 4. That is desperate, right? That's a team saying, we're not getting what we want through negotiations, so we have to leak something with the hope that it greases the wheels, and it just doesn't seem like it did, and it does seem desperate. Another way the Suns benefit is they keep players' names out of the headlines, right? We've heard this. Cam Johnson has talked about it. We've talked about the tweet from Jay Crowder and the fact that he's liking tweets with him in other uniforms. That's what you want to avoid. Now, while those players, Cam or Jay Crowder or obviously Mikal Bridges, DeAndre Ayton, they know that there are possibilities to be traded, we've not heard firm offers, right? You saw Jaylen Brown tweet SMH when that reporting came out about his availability with the Kevin Durant deal, right? And that's what you run the risk of if you let this stuff get out. Another way the Suns benefit is they just get to maintain a culture that the business side of things is handled privately and it doesn't turn messy in public. They can stay with the tune that they always intended to run it back, right? If they don't get Durant and they never were all that vocal about anything in the first place, then there's nothing to say. And they can just, go sit up there at the start of the season on media day and say, yeah, that's what we wanted to do all along. And it's like, whether it's true or not, it doesn't matter. But if they get Kevin Durant, they can just turn it into, the opportunity was too good to pass up. This is a legendary player. We love the opportunity to have him. We didn't go into the offseason expecting this, but we took advantage when it came up. You know what they would say. That's the benefit of never getting your your knees over your skis or whatever that phrase is. That's what they're doing here. And it's also, lastly, easier to keep Kevin Durant happy and not step on his toes if you don't ever say anything, right? You don't want to say the wrong thing. And the best way to not say the wrong thing is to say nothing, to be quiet, to keep things close to the vest. Now, we have heard some examples of the Suns leaking, and I'll talk about a few in the future in the next segment. But in this summer, the one substantive report we really heard about the Suns came draft week. I didn't really believe it, but it was pretty concretely reported. Jonathan Givony of ESPN said the Suns were considering moving Cam Johnson in a trade to get into the top 10 to preserve cap space that would allow them to keep DeAndre Ayton more comfortably. So that was weird. Givony is usually pretty careful. And I don't know, there's a lot of angles of where that could have come from or who would have benefited from leaking something like that. Maybe a team who wanted Cam Johnson, maybe a team who wanted DeAndre Ayton, obviously. But if any part of that did come from the Suns, I interpreted it at the time as a potential way of sending a message to the Nets that they were willing to just keep Ayton, right? Or other teams. It doesn't even have to be the Nets, because along the Nets have said they didn't want Ayton. But if you look at it from that standpoint, maybe it's a third team who would have wanted Ayton that the Suns could have included in a bigger deal, right? It was this sort of shot at make your move for Ayton now, otherwise we are willing to get aggressive to keep him, right? And that was interesting. That felt purposeful if it was from the Suns. There's a chance it was just from a whole other group in it and it wasn't from the Suns. But on the other hand, another example from this summer is how James Jones spoke about Ayton's free agency. So we can all assume safely that Ayton was very available via sign and trade, right? But all along, whether it was the day after the season ended or draft night or in this press conference and interviews he did after they brought Ayton back, Jones's public comments were always about keeping him. He's an important part of what we do. We look forward to letting the process play out, and we'd love to continue to see him develop and be part of our team going forward, right? And now that DA is back, Jones can basically say this was the plan all along. He's doing that already. And it's easier to patch things up, not only with Ayton, but publicly with fans, or the perception, reputation around the league doesn't get hurt as much. It's all much, much easier to smooth all of that over. Okay, so with those examples given, you saw how it benefited the Suns in those cases to be public a little bit and let their message be known in their own way about a situation. How the Suns have lost out by keeping quiet. There's fewer of these, but let me go through them. It's harder to put pressure on the Nets, right? We haven't really seen many teams do it. I think most teams are putting pressure on the Nets just by smoking them out a little bit right now, right? Like by waiting and daring them to be the first ones to move, by, setting the campgrounds on fire and waiting for them to run, right? But you do see the people, whoever it was, the news coming out this week was, yet another obnoxious Nets demand was that they wanted Tatum and Brown for Durant. I don't know if it's true, but leaking stuff like that makes Brooklyn look ridiculous, right? It weakens their credibility. It weakens their bargaining power around the NBA. And you lose the opportunity to do that if you handle your business the way the Suns do. You also, if you're the Suns, it's harder to explain yourself to fans after the fact, right? Not that that's super important. If you end up making a good decision, it doesn't really matter if it's hard to explain yourself. But if they don't get Durant and they never really comment on it publicly, it can make it seem like you didn't try, right? They could also, forget the media, but by not talking to other teams about this, if we assume that they're not, they could be hurting their 3-team possibilities if they're not talking to other teams about this. And then also the media is not on your side. As much as that might not feel like a big deal, you just look right now. The media is obviously pretty intrigued by the possibility of KD to Boston, Boston is a beloved NBA franchise. They're in a big market. They're near several other big markets, right? And that can sway owners. It can help a front office get a sense of whether a move is popular or not. There's a reason also, aside from negotiating or bargaining, that these things get leaked. They're little trial balloons that can be put out there to see if something is a good idea or not. And you listen to any former executives or people around sports who have been in front offices, and they'll say in interviews, they'll say in their shows, hey, this stuff does matter to owners. Owners care what the public thinks. Owners care what the media thinks. And so that's a loss. If the media is kind of not on your side, it can manifest in ways that do matter. It's hard to know what those exactly are, but it's not crazy to think that it plays a role. All things considered, though, I think maintaining a culture, I think winning the PR battle, I think keeping Kevin Durant happy with you while you try to get him, these are all more important than negotiating in public and the little bit of extra pressure you might be able to apply or a little more public media support you might be able to get by leaking stuff, by planting stuff, whatever it might be. The Suns are making the right decision, handling their business this way this summer. But has a laying low always helped James Jones? Has keeping to himself always helped? I'll walk through why that actually has almost always been the case and why it's probably a smart thing to do next. But first, one more quick break. The first time James Jones made a big move, it actually did get very public, but not by his choosing. That was the Kelly Oubre Jr. trade where Trevor Ariza, after going very, very poorly, ended up on the Washington Wizards. And we thought the trade was going to send Dillon Brooks back with Memphis, and then it ended up being that Marshawn Brooks was the one who the other teams thought was getting dealt. And then a couple of days go by, and the Suns get Kelly Oubre Jr., right? So that one got very public. It didn't end up really helping or hurting. I don't think the publicity of it is why they screwed up the Brooks thing. It's more just that they crossed wires somehow. But the other part of the Kelly Oubre thing is the contract. And that was something Jones wouldn't really comment on much. You never really heard what the Suns' position was. And the contract ended up being very fair. 2 years, $30 million. That is a through line for James Jones. He has never really overpaid anybody in free agency. And I have to think that not giving up your hand at the bargaining table with some of those contract talks does help. If you leak early, we love X player, we're going to pay what it takes to get him, and then he pisses you off, he plays poorly, he stops showing up on time, whatever, then you lose. You lose it's a lot harder to come back and undercut that after it's already been out there. So I think that's a place where it certainly helps. The next big move later that season was the Tyler Johnson trade from the Miami Heat to the Phoenix Suns. They give up Ryan Anderson, who the Heat end up cutting, and I believe a pick or something else. Tyler Johnson wasn't even known to really be available, and he played a big part for the Suns the rest of that season as a capable ball handler. He wasn't even much of a point guard, but it was close enough, and it really worked. It really paid off. They played well down the stretch of that season, as crazy as that might sound. They did. That was part of how they built up to what when Monty Williams got there and was able to take them to the next level with Ricky Rubio. And I also think with Tyler Johnson, the Suns later went on to cut him, of course, to waive him. But that situation was handled personally. I would see James Jones and Tyler Johnson having conversations about the contract. I mean, I don't know what they were talking about, but they had a good relationship, and that was handled in good faith. Tyler Johnson had no bad words to say, and it was all good after that. Cam Johnson. So the trade on draft night was good value. The pick was not. None of it was public. No one had any idea that was coming. That's really when it started to feel like Jones operates in silence. We will not know what to expect. We never can, and we never will ever. But I think actually this is one of the only examples from Jones of how being siloed from the media and other teams can come back to bite you. The lack of it feels like the lack of homework they did on what the opportunities might be to do trades on that in that draft might have screwed them over. Now, we don't know that. We can't say that for certain, but it feels like if the Suns had gotten back to the 15 to 20 range in that draft, they probably still get Cam Johnson, and they might not have to give up the 6th overall pick to do that. They might get another pick back on top, but the trade would be better. I just said the trade was good value, but I think it would have been better value. The main point is you didn't need to pick Cam Johnson at 11 because no one else was going to pick him at 11. And I think the draft consistently shows the draft is one place where the Suns' desire to be removed from that NBA, the kind of day-to-day gossip rumor mill of the NBA does seem to hurt them. They don't seem to have a great idea of how we all read that article about the Suns draft philosophy, and they don't have a lot of guys on their board, and they don't scout everybody, and they ignore a lot of players, and they keep things tight and whatever. That's all well and good. I'm not even criticizing that here. What I'm criticizing is you can do things on your own as far as the draft. But the place where I think the Suns also get screwed is not having an understanding of how other teams value players, because that's the key. That's what value means. That's what, good value means. That's what that can be the difference between a well-constructed roster and a poorly constructed roster is doing things better, beating out your competition, signing a good contract that other teams weren't paying attention on, or making a trade for a team that is undervaluing a player and you get that player. Like, this is important, and it requires being plugged in, and that is somewhere where it feels like the Suns are not always plugged in, and it does hurt them. The most recent big move that James Jones made was obviously the Chris Paul trade in the fall of 2020. And this one was unique. This one was very different. ESPN reported, Bontemps and Windhorst reported the Suns' interest 6 days before that deal got done. They even had this specific nugget. Quote, in addition to their young roster, contributing to the Suns' momentum is the near completion of the first phase of a $230 million renovation of Talking Stick Resort Arena. The Suns are also set to open a new state-of-the-art $45 million practice facility this month. Zach Lowe also had some level of information about Chris Paul and his whereabouts, but he talked about mostly that he was not going to be going to the Bucks. It makes you wonder, did Zach Lowe know that there was some legitimacy to the Suns stuff, but just couldn't report it yet? Who knows? Either way, Chris Paul to Phoenix became an open secret by mid-November of that year before the trade happened, and it does seem like the rare occasion the Suns got a little leaky under James Jones. So where does that leave us with this one? I think the fact that the ESPN story reporting the interest on the Suns' part in Chris Paul included the bit about the facilities makes me believe that this was a case of Sarver or one of his people talking around Jones in the front office. And it would not be the first time. It probably won't be the last time, although we are still waiting the arrival of any sort of information by the league about Robert Sarver. Conversation for a different day. But I think that's what happened here is because of, let's just say, if it was assistant general manager Trevor Buckstein, right? He's in the Suns front office. He's been in the Suns front office for a long time. He's been in the front office when it was leaky. He's in the front office now when it's not leaky. Let's just say he was the guy who told Windhorst and Bontemps about this potential move. I don't think that's what happened, but as a hypothetical to disprove it, let's walk through, right? Why on earth would he be talking about the momentum being related to the completion of this, Trevor Buckstein doesn't care how much the renovations cost. He doesn't care about it being a state-of-the-art practice facility. He would not be the one to drop those nuggets, right? So is it Sarver? Is it President Jason Rowley? That's probably what happened there. And so I think that is a little bit of an outlier, but it also shows, the media part of it. There was support. It was like, wow, the Suns are making a splash. Fans obviously got excited. I don't think this one was too big of a deal because it basically it feels like it was a done deal by the time the rumors started to come out about it. But that didn't hurt anybody. It didn't harm anybody that news came out, right? Ricky Rubio didn't come out and lash out at anybody. Kelly Oubre didn't go on a tweet storm. Like, these things can be okay to leak if you do it right. This is part of the NBA, and it can be done well. So I don't want to give the impression that being as quiet as James Jones is just always the right answer. But I do think as we've gone through all of this, whether it's this week, this summer, or this era of Suns basketball, it is more often than not benefited James Jones to operate this way. He has set a precedent that he will not negotiate in public. He will not risk the culture of the team for small gains here and there in these negotiations, right? And that might and probably does hurt as a fan. It might just be frustrating to follow along with, even if you don't really care one way or the other. There's just this gap of information, and that's not fun. These sports is supposed to be about distracting yourself and having fun. And if there's nothing to go off of, it can drive you a little crazy. But it helps James Jones do his job. It is clearly his MO. It is clearly something that makes him feel good about the way he's operating as a leader of this franchise, and it's not stopping anytime soon. It's not stopping anytime soon. That'll do it for the week, guys. A big thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen here on this Friday, continuing 3 days a week strong throughout the month of August. Aaron Edwards will be back next week, guys. He was DNP with a pulled muscle in his side today. We can get some more information about exactly what happened when he's back on the show. But that'll do it. Go make Locked On NBA your second listen now to catch up on everything else going on around the league.